Town Meeting Day brought communities across the state together this week to weigh in on a wide range of issues.
I think town meeting is a wonderful opportunity for communities to come together and listen to people who, and listen hard to people who don't see the world through the same lens they do.
We'll recap results and hear how school budgets fared this year. Plus, a federal program to reform how the state pays for health care faces an uncertain future. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, March 7th. And joining us on the panel this week, April McCullum from Vermont Public, Peter Dioria from VTDigger, and Aaron Calvin from the Stowe Reporter, News and Citizen. Thank you all so much for being here. Of course, we're going to be talking about Town Meeting Day and what a difference a year makes. School districts across the state breathed a sigh of relief this week as over 90% of spending plans won voter approval this year, a big change from last Town Meeting Day, where nearly a third of the budgets failed. Budgets passed in at least 101 districts on Tuesday, that according to preliminary data compiled by the state's superintendent and school boards associations, and failed in just 9 districts, many of which typically have trouble passing their budgets in any case. April McCullum, I want to start with you on this situation here. Again, big difference this year to last, 90% of these budgets passing. What's the early take on why these budgets had such better voter approval this year?
Well, in a lot of cases, the school districts were being quite conservative with their budgeting, cutting positions, even making unpopular choices, and trying to keep things level as much as they could, even though they had cost pressures that were pushing the budget up, even just with the status quo. There wasn't as much of a threat of a giant tax increase this year like there was last year. There also wasn't the chaos of some of the legislative maneuvering that we saw last year, where there was this last-minute scramble to try to delay things. So just overall, a more smoother year for approval. But of course, there's this bigger conversation happening about education and finance reform, and I don't think the pressure is really going to let up that much on that conversation.
Yeah, and the governor was quick to point out, too, that, he says we shouldn't really be celebrating this. I mean, it looks like budgets are going up about 6% or just under that a little bit, different than 16% from the year before. So that is a kind of a win there. But there are still pressures on the budgets here, and he wants something to get done for governance in the future and financing for education, right? Right,
because next year there's going to be more cost pressures, and this is just going to continue. And so even though they can get through this year, there's some communities where things are getting to an unsustainable level, and that's not going to go away.
Yeah, but again, most of these budgets passing and on first tries. Peter Dioria, something that I found really interesting about this is that we know that healthcare costs for schools are really going through the roof. We have a graphic that we're going to show you here. Since 2018, it looks like they've more than doubled these healthcare premiums for school employees. So, given that, and given that these are tied to some of the school budgets, how is it that schools were able to come up with these reasonable, for voters anyway, budgets, given these healthcare costs?
Yeah, that's a great point. This is one of the really, really big pressures that is, driving up these school budgets, driving up these property tax rates. In 2018, healthcare was something like 10% of school spending statewide. Now it's 15%. You saw that chart that you just showed. So districts have had to make, as April was talking about, just a lot of choices, run really, really lean. We reported that something, I think the NEA estimated something like 300 or 400 positions had been cut statewide. This is teachers, this is classroom assistants, this is admin roles, this is bus service in some cases, nursing staff, cutting classrooms. School districts are really, really cognizant of, I think, some of the chaos that you mentioned, certainly last year, and really trying to avoid that and trying to make cuts where they can so these budgets pass.
Yeah, we're going to come to some of these healthcare costs and situations a little bit later in the show because it really is quite striking. Now, in addition to weighing in on school budgets, some towns were also considering what to do with school buildings that are no longer being used as education facilities. Aaron, what did the voters of Belvedere have to say about their town school building?
So the future of their school was a major topic at their town meeting day, even though there was no binding resolution made. It's kind of a microcosm or a specific example of an issue that I think has affected and will affect a lot of small towns throughout Vermont. Belvedere has a population of 358 people, one of the smallest towns in Vermont. Their town meeting comprised about 25 people in Belvedere Central School. It's one of the only buildings in the town large enough to host a public gathering of that size. It used to host a pre-K cohort until that cohort was merged with neighboring Waterville in a round of budget cuts to the Lamoille North Supervisory Union last year. Now, they are faced with whether or not the town wants to take ownership of this building. And there is sort of a dilemma that they're faced with. Their town municipal budget is only about $100,000. The annual cost of maintaining this building would be about $100,000, according to some school board members. So that's a sizable cost for those taxpayers to take on.
That's right up against it, yeah.
Right, and so some are raising the alarm that we can't afford this, but other people are saying we have the opportunity to acquire a space like this that doesn't come along very often. And the Belvedere Community Club, which hosts events in that town, has been using it to hold events during the winter and bring the community together. So it's really quite a dilemma.
Okay, a larger than usual number of Vermont municipalities considered local option taxes for town meeting day this year, with a mixed response from the voters. Some of the reasons behind those proposals were rising costs and climate and healthcare crises, a desire to reduce property taxes, plus a simpler approval process after a change to state law last year made it easier for municipalities to adopt local option taxes. April, tell us a bit about the local option tax for those of us who may not be steeped in this kind of thing. What's it all about?
Sure. So the municipalities have the choice to add 1% to the sales tax rate, rooms and meals, alcoholic beverages, and they get to keep a lot of that money if they choose to enact that local tax. And it's in some ways an attractive place to look, especially in an era of school budgets rising and tax rates being under pressure. At least this is another lever you can pull that's not on the town tax rate. Of course, a lot of town residents end up paying that tax and things like sales. It depends on the community, and so in some communities, the argument is, well, it's mostly tourists who'll be paying this, and so that might be more palatable for them. So, and the legislature made it easier last year to enact these so that they do not have to get legislative approval every time, and so then there's been kind of this wave of new towns who had never been able to do this before, considering this option for their finances. And
it looks like voters were, willing to go this route. I think we have a graphic about how many of these towns approved local option taxes. There you go. Hartford, Marlborough, Middlebury, Montpelier, Springfield, all saying yes. They did fail in Royalton and in Whitingham. So thank you for that explainer on the option taxes there. It's great to know how these things actually work. Aaron Calvin, I want to get back to you on covering Lamoille County. And what are some of the big takeaways from town meeting day?
Well, so Peter was talking about how very few towns voted down their school budgets. One of those towns was Wolcott. They voted down their budget after they saw a large increase proposed, partially due to the tuition cap going up. It would have required them to pay $400,000 more to send their kids to middle and high school outside of their town, and a significant revenue shortfall in Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union, which would have also required them to contribute an extra $400,000 to the broader school district. In Hyde Park, we saw a resolution to a sort of an interesting technicality problem that had arisen, where it turned out that the town of Hyde Park had been conducting illegitimate Australian ballot elections for 30 years.
For 30 years?
Yes, and it required some legislative action, actually. It was the first bill signed by the governor this session, but eventually we kind of all came to the conclusion, it seems like, that Hyde Park, I guess, was the canary in the coal mine. There were many other towns in Vermont that had not been following state statute and electing only some officers by Australian ballot. Now that's totally legal, and Hyde Park is going back to doing things the way they always had.
That is fascinating. Thank you for giving the update on that. And we're going to get into some of these, in-person voting questions in a moment too. Now, in some Vermont communities, a question about voting itself was on the ballot. And here are two Waterbury residents debating the merits of in-person voting, as I was just talking about. Here's both arguments on that side.
It makes me sad that people are thinking that it's more convenient, and yet it is more convenient to just simply check a box. But we should be fighting, our board should be fighting to get people to come to this meeting.
5% of the eligible voters making decisions for the rest of us. How can we possibly know the will of the people when only 5% of the eligible voters is voting?
April McCullum, this is such an interesting question here, and it really gets to the heart of what town meeting day is all about. On the one hand, yes, you want this, this participatory factor of people coming together, talking about these issues, but as the other woman in that clip was pointing out, not a lot of people overall really take part in this.
Yeah, and some towns have worked really hard, changing the time or the day of their meeting, providing childcare, providing transportation, doing a potluck, all these things to try to encourage participation. And in some cases, I think I've had some success with that. But fundamentally, yeah, you're probably not going to get as many people voting when they have to show up and spend a few hours on a Tuesday morning, for example, as one option to make these decisions. But I think this year, we heard quite a few people really feeling emotional about this chance to be in a room with their neighbors, to be able to raise questions and concerns, feeling very affectionate for that form of democracy in a time where national politics feel very chaotic. This is something that's steady. So I think it was notable hearing that this year.
There are some towns in Vermont I know that do their town meeting days on Saturday. There aren't very many of them, but this reflects the larger national debate too about whether or not it makes sense to have national elections on a Tuesday when, again, as you pointed out, people have to work. Some people can't get childcare. These are issues that perhaps keep people from going to their town meeting day.
Right, and so then often it's just skewed representation of the town. So yeah, it was interesting. Linden is another example that happened this year, and Waterbury also. They both voted to stick with in-person. Linden had been remote since the pandemic, and this was their first time back in person, and then they decided to stay with in-person. So yeah, really interesting that this is kind of the end of that pandemic era of a lot of ballot and remote voting.
I think it's good that people are just talking about it. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, if I was just going to jump in real quick, I reported on this last year and in Jericho, and you saw sort of the clip of people getting really, really emotional. I think part of why people feel so strongly about this is it seems like it's like a centuries-old Vermont tradition, and it's like so part of the state's identity in so many ways. It's like local participatory democracy. And then on the other side, as you got it, there's like this equity issue, right? And not only getting off of work or getting childcare, but also, if you have a disability, maybe it's hard for you to come out to vote.
Right.
And I think this is just this fascinating story that, you've been following.
Mm-hmm. Getting to the question of where ATVs should be allowed has proven controversial in some parts of the state, leading to heated debate about where these vehicles should operate. Highgate voters signaled support for the non-binding article advising the select board to allow all-terrain vehicles on town roads on Tuesday. But in Fletcher, voters resoundingly rejected the idea, disapproving of ATV road use. I want to get to the issue of Middle East resolutions that came up during town meeting day. This is an example, April, of issues where town meeting day goes well beyond local politics. And there were some resolution questions dealing with the war in the Middle East and support for Palestinians. What can you tell us about some of those votes?
Yeah, so this was a number of towns were considering what was, as far as I could tell, the same statement, at least as it was presented to them, which was termed an apartheid-free community pledge, and it was support for the Palestinian people and opposing what they termed Israel's settler similar colonialism and apartheid actions and things like that. And so, yeah, in some towns it was very emotional and touched on a lot of, as you can imagine, very heated opinions. And it's an example, there's this long history of this actually in Vermont. This is one of the things that's kind of, I guess, special about town meeting day is that these meetings are a chance for people to make these non-binding, symbolic votes about what they think about national, global politics. It's not the first time it's happened. And so it's a way for people to feel like they have their voice heard, even though they know this is not going to in itself change anything.
Yeah, folks who were listening to Vermont Edition this week heard a great example of that, where some old tape was played from 1982 when folks were weighing in on the issue of banning nuclear weapons. And it's just fascinating. You know, again, Vermonters showing that they're paying attention not just to what's happening locally, they've got opinions on what's happening at a national and international scale as well. Now in Rutland, Mayor Michael Donges has won re-election. He beat former city clerk and Board of Aldermen member Henry Heck with about 56% of the vote counted. Ballot items passing in Burlington included 3 charter changes. One gives the City Council authority to determine how much notice landlords must give before terminating leases. Another eliminates the need for the legislature to approve the City Council's redistricting. And the third would ban guns in bars. Now, all 3 of these charter changes would need approval from the state legislature and the governor before they take effect. And here's the Burlington City Council president on the issue of banning guns in bars.
Isn't a red state, blue state issue. States like Texas, Kentucky, Louisiana, states like New York and other blue states too have recognized that guns and alcohol don't mix. I think this is something Vermont should actually take on a statewide basis.
And that was Ben Travers, again, a City Council president, talking about the issue of guns in bars. But again, April, this is something that, you know, it's come up before, and it won't happen unless the legislature decides to take action, and the governor too, right?
Right, and last time, so Burlington did pass this once before, and as far as I remember, it didn't really go anywhere at all in the legislature, and gets to the hesitance that the legislature has to do kind of patchwork gun laws across the state in different communities. And so, yeah, maybe it will have to be a statewide decision, as Ben Travers was saying, at some point, because I think the legislature so far has been very hesitant to touch that in these local ordinances. One
more town meeting day item I want to get to. Voters in Royalton rejected a measure to adopt new restrictions on development in floodplains and river corridors on Tuesday. Now, these regulations would have banned new development in the 500-year floodplain and imposed new restrictions on new development in river corridors. River corridors are the area where a river is likely to move and change over the course of years, which is where much of the most erosive and dangerous flooding happens in Vermont. The state is in the midst of writing the first ever statewide regulations on new construction in river corridors. They're due to go into effect in the year 2028. You know, Aaron, this gets to the future of Lamoille River's floodplain analysis, which is kind of in an uncertain position, right?
Right. They've done some initial hydrology studies. That lays the groundwork for understanding how floods affect communities through the Lamoille River corridor, basically from Hardwick through Fairfax in Georgia. And, you know, this lays the groundwork for towns to be able to build off of this and gives them a sense of how to do that and provide some work so that they don't have to do that initial upfront cost to, you know, maybe start some different projects to do some different flood mitigation stuff. Now you have 17 buyouts alone in Johnson, including their former grocery store, that are still pending. And,
Sterling Market, right?
Yeah, Sterling Market. And, you know, there's a new general store coming into Johnson, but it's going to be a lot smaller than the old grocery store. And in the meantime, there's a lot of questions about how to best use this new town-owned green space to prevent future flooding from having the devastating effects that it had in 2023. But with you know, the chaos that we talked about at the federal level, a lot of federal representatives at the Lamoille County Planning Commission meeting in February voiced a lot of uncertainty about, you know, the very vital federal grants that, you know, these towns need in order to do this kind of work. So, you know, this hydrological study is really interesting. We'll see what towns can ultimately do with it.
And talking about uncertainty at a federal level, Peter, this gets us to this issue of healthcare. The fate of the federal healthcare payment reform program is now in question. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I will try not to bore people. This is a federal program that Vermont has been selected for. It's scheduled to start in 2027. It's called the AHEAD model. And basically it would help Vermont draw down quite a bit of money sort of in Medicare dollars. It would allow Vermont hospitals a little more flexibility, Vermont providers more flexibility in spending that money. And it would direct some funding to primary care. So, as we talked about before, in Vermont, healthcare is extremely, extremely expensive. The state has been looking for ways to sort of, help make it more accessible, help lower costs, help improve the quality of the care. We'd sort of been expecting this program. But amid this federal chaos that you're mentioning, whether or not this thing is going to go forward is an open question. The feds, they issued what's known as a communications hold. So they're not talking to Vermont about it. A number of the people who had been working on this at the federal side are no longer working there with the federal government. They canceled a bunch of meetings with Vermont. And so I think some sort of players in the healthcare world are saying, we got to forget this. We got to sort of, look within our borders and see what we can do locally to bring costs down and bring up quality.
But the federal money is so important. There's tax credits involved. There's, insurance rates. How in the world could that happen locally? And when you talk to legislators, they must be expressing some frustration about how they can operate with that communications block you're talking about. If they don't know what's coming from the feds, how can they make these decisions locally?
Yeah, I think this is an open question. I think everyone is sort of looking at the federal government and saying, who knows what's going to come out this week? Who knows what's going to come out next week? Who knows what's going to come out the week after? There has been some sort of percolating legislation in the State House around healthcare. I don't know yet. I don't think anyone knows yet if it's going to go anywhere. There's been a lot of focus quite recently, actually, just before this town meeting day week recess, a couple of bills that are looking very closely at hospital spending. Hospital spending is one of the really, really big drivers of, health insurance spending, the cost of premiums, that chart we saw earlier.
Sure.
And I think, we'll see where it goes. It's early days, but I think it reflects an appetite, at least among some lawmakers, as sort of looking at hospitals, looking at their costs.
If you want to take a deeper dive into all this, by the way, Brave Little State has a recent episode out called Why is Health Insurance So Expensive in Vermont? It digs real deep into some of these issues. But, Peter, as you were saying, these operating costs are just continuing to spiral. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, the state's largest health insurer by far, reporting losses of $62 million.
Yeah, so that was in 2024. They've lost money, I think, for at least the 3 previous years, or at least the 2 previous years. Blue Cross Blue Shield, largest commercial insurer in the state, insures roughly a third of the state's population. And so, when they lose a bunch of money and they have to hike premiums, that affects a huge, huge swath of the population.
Yeah.
Folks who buy that insurance through the individual, marketplace, an individual plan, they can get a lot of federal and state help in bringing down their premiums. Really, these small groups, these small employers that are buying this insurance, they have to sort of just eat these price increases to a very large degree. It really falls kind of on their shoulders, and that, affects a huge number of small businesses in the state.
Really appreciate your reporting on that. We'll keep following that as well. And, every once in a while, Vermont makes news well beyond our Green Mountains here. And this was certainly the case when Vice President J.D. Vance came to visit with his family for a ski trip. Hundreds of protesters gathered in Waitsfield last Saturday to protest and counter-protest during a visit from J.D. Vance, who was in the state with his family again skiing here. You could see some of the signs. A lot of people were angry about this. Was right after that kind of chaotic and really, frankly, surreal meeting with the Ukrainian president at the White House. One of the signs that was up there said, J.D. Vance skis in jeans. I don't know about any of you can think of a more insulting remark to make for those of us who ski in Vermont. folks were definitely upset about this. April, it just showed again, Vermonters are paying attention. They came out in droves. That's a lot of people for Waitsfield, right?
Yeah, they came out for that. They came out at the airport when the vice president was arriving and departing. People were really tuned into it over the weekend, and the nation was as well. Vermont was the topic of conversation. And by the way, J.D. Vance said on social media afterward that that Vermont was beautiful and he barely noticed the protesters.
And that was even though he did have to move his location, right, to where they were staying.
Yes. That I believe it was from an inn to an undisclosed location, so that there may be more privacy for the visit.
Well, it was certainly interesting to see Vermont reflected in national news, even international news, as you say. And by the way, Vermont is kicking off its maple sugaring season. It is that time of year. And of course, with everything happening with the tariffs, we'll have to see how that affects the maple sugaring industry as well. A lot of the equipment that local producers here buy comes from Canada. It may well have an effect. And I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it for today. Thank you so much to our panel, April McCullum from Vermont Public, Peter DiOria from VTDigger, and Aaron Calvin from the Stowe Reporter. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. This is Vermont This Week. Hope you'll tune in next week as well. Hope you have a great week in the meantime.